Hello, welcome back. Today we celebrate the 18th Sunday of Year C, and the readings really reflect on a very simple proposition in one sense, and that is that as Christians we need to hone in on what's really important in life and not worry so much about other things that will pass away, but what's really important for eternity. If we reflect on our own experience, our own life history, it's probably true for most of us that for the better part of our lives, we spend our time providing for others and providing for ourselves. We also live in a society which is kind of changing rapidly and where our whole self-worth, if we're not careful, can tend to revolve around being successful or being approved of by whatever the prevailing orthodoxy in the way society thinks and behaves is at the time. And this can be a real challenge for us as Christians as we're moving into a world that really is, at least in the Western world, post-Christian. First, we try to make sure that we have enough for our children and for ourselves, that we have a roof over our head, that we have food and clothing. But then we can also get, which are important things, but then we can also get trapped in the media and consumer hype, where advertising tends to say you can't possibly be happy unless you have the latest and the best of everything. So people are constantly upgrading things, particularly when it comes to computers and iPhones, etc., etc. Perhaps that's something you haven't got caught up in, but there are plenty of people, both younger and older today, who really get caught up in the consumer hype. So it is very easy for us to become obsessed or enslaved by things that ultimately do not bring us happiness and are destined to pass away. They might make us happy for a little while, but they're not going to last, and they won't really bring us true happiness, the true happiness we long for, all of us, whether we know it or not, which is communion with God. So today's scriptures remind us that we need to keep a proper perspective about things, and that's regardless of our age, 20 years or 80 years or 100 years. We need to reflect on what are the things that we truly value, and are they really worth it? Should we be valuing those things? We cannot risk losing ourselves in what is passing and losing out on what is truly of worth. What is that? It's relationship, not things, but relationship. First and foremost, our relationship with God, which is an eternal relationship, but also our relationship with our loved ones and each other in general, because they also have the potential to be eternal, because that's what's truly worth pursuing. Relationships, good, healthy relationships, are eternal. In addition to this, St. Paul in the second reading reminds us that if we get trapped and immersed in the things of this world, they can easily tempt us to greed and immorality. And he sort of gives a little list there, and he does in other places too. He talks about sexual activity outside of a valid marriage, impurity, guilty passions, evil desires, greed. And he notes that when these become part of our lives, they become a false god. We're worshipping an idol. And he's reminding us that if we get caught up in those things, in different lifestyles and behaviors that are contrary to the gospel, we run the risk of losing everything, even our eternal life. It's important to be good providers of food, clothing, and shelter for ourselves and our family, but the most important thing is that we provide time and love, and to teach each other of the love that God has for us. And that's important too, because love is a word that gets bandied around a lot in our society, and it's a word that's become totally abused. And in the scriptures, there are different words in the Greek that we just translate as love. When we talk about God's love for us or our love for God, the word is agape. And it's not an erotic love. It doesn't exclude that. It's not even a love of friendship. It doesn't exclude that either. But what it is a firm commitment. It's an act of the will to actively work for the good of the other person. And the ultimate good for the other person is for them to come into a deep communion with God, who has loved them and is loving them into existence. And how do we know that we're in that communion? How do we know that when we're in that love of God? Well, we know it through the way that he has revealed himself to us, which is through Jesus Christ, through the teachings of Christ, and the teachings of Christ's body, the church, through which Jesus teaches us today. So that's the greatest way that we show agape, real love, to not only ourselves as Christians, but to the wider world. Whether they accept it or not, whether it offends them or not, is beyond our power. We can't worry about that. All we can do is invite and call. There's a story about St. Francis, how he was having a meal with a bishop who was a friend of his. And the bishop, somebody had got in the ear of the bishop and asked him to sort of speak some reason to St. Francis. So the bishop was trying to persuade Francis to be a bit more reasonable about his life of poverty. Exasperated, the bishop asked Francis why he was so adamant about living a life of poverty. And Francis said to him, if we were to have possessions, then we'd have to build walls around them to house them. Then we would have to take up arms against our fellow men in order to protect our possessions from theft. Then we would no longer be brothers to all people. And that kind of left the bishop speechless, because it's true. And we know it's true too. I know it's true. We've had some break-ins recently in our parish, and now we're looking at putting surveillance cameras and things like that. So again, it's a conundrum. How do we open ourselves up to be brothers and sisters to each other without the other person becoming an enemy? And it's seeking to divest ourselves. This is what Francis understood and why he was so keen on not owning anything. But he didn't want to be poor for the sake of poor, but because he realized that once you have things, you have to defend them. And once you have something to be defended, then you're no longer a brother or sister to others, because they become a threat to your possessions. But what he was talking about really, when he gets down to it, and this is where, when you hear me talking about Francis in these terms, you might think, well, that's not realistic. But what he was really getting to, which is something that that applies to all of us, is not so much about material possessions, because for Francis that was relatively easy to give up. But what he was really on about were spiritual possessions. Things like wanting to have a good name, things like wanting to be loved and approved of and accepted by others. All things which are good and natural. Things like, but there are some others that aren't so good, aren't so balanced. Things like the desire to be always right, or the fear of being seen to be wrong. The desire to always get our own way, to impose our will on others, just so that we get what we want. Or the desire to take revenge on someone who has embarrassed us by trying to humiliate them in some way. These are the struggles that we have. So we have this lifelong struggle in all of us. And sometimes our society doesn't understand that. And even many Christians don't understand that. Why do we sin? Well, nobody gets up and says, how evil can I be today? We rationalize what we want and say that it's good. We don't admit that it's sinful or wrong, even though we might know deep down. But what are we really doing? Why do we do those things? It's because we long for happiness. We want to be happy. We want to be loved and to be loved. We want to be accepted for who we are. And those are all good things. In fact, they're God-given desires. But the reality of human beings is that all of us, myself included, we're all fallen. And that's really something that often in the Catholic Church we talk about original sin, but it's the same kind of thing. It's not a sin per se, but it's our perspective, our vision has been skewed. So we seek to find ways of happiness, to find happiness and to find fulfillment, which are good things, which really are pointing us to a desire for God, whether we know it or not, but we tend to look for them in dead ends. And so we might say, oh, I want that, but I can't afford it. So I'll just sort of surreptitiously nick it, shoplift, things like that. So we look for happiness, and we think that doing something or being in a particular lifestyle is going to give us happiness. And it might for a time. But will it give us that eternal happiness that God longs for us all to have? So when we see people sinning, even when we sin ourselves, we need to have compassion. We need to understand that they're just looking for happiness in the wrong place. They're looking for fulfillment in the wrong place. It doesn't mean, though, that we condone the behavior. It doesn't mean that we condone or celebrate the sin. So the Christian has always had this dilemma, not only within themselves, but in responding to other people, Christians and otherwise, that we're called to always love, respect, and support people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we condone their behavior or that we celebrate it. We recognize sin as it is, but we also recognize that everybody, no matter who they are, is a beloved child of God. Catholics would have heard it years ago. You don't hear it so much now, but it still holds true. It's that pithy saying, love the sinner, hate the sin. But then that's true. When the church talks about sin, we're not talking about downgrading or putting a person down or being an anti a person or anti a particular kind of person. We're talking about actions, behavior. So to give an example, I've noticed, we have troubles as Christians dealing with this in our society, because people often now equate lifestyles and behavior with the person themselves. So if you criticize a particular action or behavior, it's seen to be denigrating or downgrading the person who perpetrates it. But for Christians, that's not true. And that can make it hard for us, because in our society, as things go on, we as Christians are living in a society that no longer lives or even admits or agrees with much of Christianity or its understanding of morality. And so the pressure is on us to conform to society rather than conform to Christ. To give you an example of how this kind of works, though, because it's just recently we've had a change of federal government, and quite sadly, the new president of the Senate, one of her first acts is to try and get rid of the saying of the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, before the Senate sits. Now, on one level, I can understand this, because in our society now, it's very multicultural, and we have many members of Parliament who aren't Christians, who are members of other religions or who are atheists, and they don't want to be saying a prayer that they don't believe. That's not who they are. In other words, it's giving out a false image of who they are. They feel like it's being imposed on them. I can understand that. However, we've had another incident recently where, when a certain group of people go against the prevailing orthodoxy in our society, they're not really respected. They're denigrated. The pressure is on them to conform. And that's my football team. Some of you may know that I'm a rabid Manly supporter. And it's unfortunate that just recently they had a round where they brought out a gay pride jersey. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not anti-gay. I'm not anti-anybody. But it was imposed on the players without any kind of notice or anything else. And of course, there are a number of players in that team, 7 of them in fact, who are devout Christians. Now, they're not necessarily anti the person, but they're anti the behaviour. And the gay pride, symbol of the rainbow, they've appropriated the rainbow, isn't just about accepting people with a homosexual orientation, but it's also, there's an underlying emphasis about accepting behaviour as well. And that's what these Manly players really could not accept. So they refused to wear the jersey, and because they refused to wear the jersey, the club wouldn't change the jersey, so they had to sit out the game. And they've had people supporting them, but they've also had a lot of people vilifying them. But in fact, they didn't bring it on themselves. This was imposed on them. They weren't making any sort of forthright statements attacking any particular people. It was simply imposed on them. And I don't believe that they were being anti anybody. They were just not going to have that imposed on them so that it looks like they were condoning and celebrating behaviours that they don't believe in. So we seem to have a double standard. The President of the Senate wants to stop that in the Senate, but it's imposed on others who go against the prevailing orthodoxy. This is the trouble that we have in our society at the moment. But as Christians, even when we're misunderstood, we're called to not allow that to stop us loving, cherishing, respecting and supporting all people, no matter who they are, what their ethnic race is, what their sexual orientation is. Because ultimately orientation is not a choice, it just is. But like everything else, what you do with it is a choice. So just as we don't condone or celebrate homosexual activity, we also don't condone or celebrate heterosexual activity when it's outside a valid marriage. But we're not anti-heterosexuals. We're not anti-anybody. We are simply seeking to live as best we can, according to the teachings of Christ and his church, and seeking to love people with the kind of love that God is talking about, agape, to work for the good of those around us. That's really at the heart of this of the gospel and the readings today, that what is most important is relationship, that we love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul and strength, and that we love our neighbour as Christ loves them. And the perfect example to me of how Christ loves us, apart from the cross itself, is the story of the woman caught in adultery. And she's been used as a pawn by those who've caught her. Now, there's no argument that what she has done is commit adultery, although you have to ask, where's the man? It takes two to tango. But they're going to stone her to death, and Jesus saves her. He protects her. But when they go, he says to her, where are those who have condemned you? And she looks around, there's nobody there. And he says, neither do I condemn you. But he doesn't say to her then, just keep doing what you're doing, go on your merry way. He says, go, but don't sin again. And there you have the example that's given to us, to love each other, but not to condone certain behaviours, but to love each other because we're all the beloved children of God. May God bless you.